Room 55 of the British Museum is quieter than the rooms around it. The Assyrian lion hunts are down the hall, drawing crowds, pulling phones from pockets. Here, the cases are smaller. The objects inside them are not beautiful in any immediate way, not gilded, not painted, not carved into the shape of anything recognisable. They are rectangles of baked clay, palm-sized, covered in marks that most visitors walk past in under 4 seconds. BM 78941 sits in its case. It is the colour of a riverbank after a long dry summer. The reed stylus impressions covering its surface are pressed slightly deeper on some lines than others, a detail visible under the case lighting if you stand close enough and angle your head. The scribe who made those marks was not a senior man. The colophon at the bottom of the companion tablet names him Ipiq-Aya, junior scribe. He copied this text during a month when Ammi-Saduqa was king of Babylon, placing him at approximately 1700 BC, though the story he was copying was already old by then, already circulating in multiple versions across the river cities of southern Mesopotamia. What Ipiq-Aya copied was a creation narrative. It is called the Atrahasis epic, after its human protagonist, and it is one of the oldest sustained accounts of why humans exist. Not in the vague sense that all creation myths address that question. In the specific, almost bureaucratic sense, humans were made because the gods needed the work done and the lesser gods had stopped doing it. That is the official answer the text provides. But there is something else pressed into the clay, so quietly distributed across 4 independent textual traditions that it took generations of scholars working across multiple archives to see its shape. The clay records what the gods decided humans should be able to do, and it is careful, in ways that only become visible when several tablets are read alongside each other, to record what humans were never given access to, not as absence, not as oversight, as decision. What makes the pattern in these texts unusual is not that a ceiling exists. Most theological traditions encode limits on human access to divine knowledge. That is what theology does. What is unusual is the consistency with which the same texts that establish the ceiling also describe a channel through it. Not a breach, not an accident, a designed aperture, maintained by the God who built the wall, available under specific conditions, requiring something the humans below cannot provide from within themselves. This investigation will locate that channel precisely. It will also locate the moment after the flood when the channel was closed, and the question of whether closed means sealed or simply locked. A junior scribe in Babylon pressed those marks into clay and did not explain them, because in 1700 BC the explanation was not necessary. Everyone in the scribal culture knew the shape of the world, the gods above, the humans below. And between them a boundary so thoroughly encoded into mythology, law, liturgy, and institutional practice that it had become invisible through sheer familiarity. You do not explain the ceiling to the people living under it. You do not need to. It explains itself through what keeps not happening, through what humans keep reaching for and consistently failing to grasp. This investigation is not about whether the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors. That framework associated primarily with the popular writer Zecharia Sitchin, whose translations mainstream Assyriology has rejected systematically and in detail, most comprehensively in the published critiques of scholar Michael Heiser, is one reading among many. And it is not the reading the primary texts support when examined philologically. The Anunnaki, as they appear in the cuneiform record, are gods of the Sumerian and Akkadian pantheon, powerful, often competitive, occasionally cruel, deeply invested in maintaining an order that served their purposes. They do not need to be aliens to be interesting. What they are, in the primary sources, is consistent. Across 4 independent textual traditions, the Atrahasis epic, the myth of Enki and Ninmah, the Adapa narrative, and the standard Babylonian Gilgamesh, a pattern repeats with a persistence that rewards close attention. Humans are given enough to function. They are not given enough to transcend. And on the few occasions when a human approaches the boundary, when the ceiling becomes visible and a hand reaches toward it, something intervenes. Sometimes that something looks protective. Sometimes it is not entirely clear what it is. Ipiq-Aya pressed his stylus into the clay and moved on to the next line. He probably did not think he was recording a philosophy of human limitation. He was doing his job, the job humans were made for, according to the very text he was copying. The recursion is perfect and completely unintentional, which is perhaps the most Mesopotamian thing about it. If you are listening to this tonight, from somewhere in the English-speaking world, from Lagos or London, from Chennai or Chicago, from Nairobi or New South Wales, welcome. The tablets have been waiting a long time. They are patient objects. So are we. Part 2. The rebellion before the creation before there were humans. The gods dug canals. This is not a metaphor. The Atrahasis epic opens with a division of the cosmos among the great gods. Anu took the sky, Enlil took the earth, Enki took the waters of the deep, and then immediately turns to the question of who would do the physical labour that cosmic order requires. The answer was the Igigi, the lesser gods, the worker gods, whose names appear in administrative lists below the great Anunnaki in the divine hierarchy. They were given spades. They were put to work on the Tigris and Euphrates, clearing channels, hauling soil, maintaining the hydraulic infrastructure that the land between the rivers depended on. They did this for a precisely stated period of time, 3,600 years. In Sumerian mathematical notation, 3,600 is 1 Sar, the largest unit in the standard sexagesimal system, a number with cosmic resonance in Mesopotamian numerology. The antediluvian rains on the World Blundell Prism, now housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, are calculated in multiples of this base. Alulim of Eridu reigned 28,800 years. Alulgar reigned 36,000. The precision in these numbers is not ornamental. In Mesopotamian cosmological thinking, a full Sar is the measure of a completed age. The Igigi worked for 1 complete cosmic age. Then they stopped. What happened at the end of that age is described in the Atrahasis text with a bluntness that Stephanie Daly's 1989 Oxford translation renders directly. The Igigi set fire to their tools. They burned their spades and their carrying baskets and marched in the middle of the night to the dwelling of Enlil, the king of the gods, and surrounded his house. Enlil, woken from sleep, was frightened. He called for his vizier Nusku and for Anu and Enki, and the 4 of them convened an emergency assembly in the dark to determine what to do about the fact that the entire labour force of the cosmos had gone on strike. What happens next reveals something important about how the Mesopotamian theological mind categorized the problem of human existence, because the solution to the labour strike is not negotiation, not redistribution of work, not divine automation. It is the creation of a new category of being. Enki speaks first, and his solution is characteristically practical. He proposes that one of the striking gods be slaughtered, The blood and flesh of this slaughtered god will be mixed with clay by the birth goddess Nintu, also called Mami, also called Ninhursag or Ninma, depending on the text and period, and from this mixture a new being will be formed. This being will carry the baskets. This being will dig the canals. This being will relieve the Ajiji of the work that was, by the time of the rebellion, one full cosmic age past bearable. The creature created from this process is called, in the text's own term, Lulu, a Sumerian Akkadian compound that scholars have translated variously as primitive, mixed, or, most neutrally, the human being. The etymology suggests something formed from combination rather than from a single pure source. The human is not a reduced god. The human is a compound clay plus something divine, and what that compound adds up to is the central question the text refuses to answer cleanly. The god chosen for slaughter is identified in different recensions by slightly different names. The most commonly cited is Ila-Wela, though some manuscripts give the name as We or Geshtu-E. What all the versions agree on is the single attribute Enki uses to justify the choice. The slaughtered god is selected because he had intelligence. The Akkadian word is temu, which carries the specific meaning of reason, cognitive capacity, deliberative thought. Not just sensation or reflex, but the capacity to weigh, to deliberate, to decide. This is where the text stops and the question begins. Mami mixes the clay with the blood and flesh. She recites an incantation. 14 pieces of clay are pinched off, 7 on the right, 7 on the left, 7 males, 7 females. The womb goddesses assemble. The humans are born. And the text does not say the intelligence transfers. It says something more specific and more ambiguous than that. It says that a ghost and a temu comes into existence from the slaughtered god's flesh. And it says that this ghost exists in the human so that the god is not forgotten. The ghost is a memorial. It is a persistence of divine substance in human form. But Etemu and Temu are different words in Akkadian. One is a soul remnant, a shade, a presence that persists after death. The other is active reasoning capacity, the kind of deliberate intelligence that distinguished the slaughtered god from a mere beast. Whether one becomes the other when mixed into clay, the text does not say. W.G. Lambert and A.R. Millard noted this ambiguity in their foundational 1969 edition of the Atrahasis text. Neither was able to close it, because the text itself appears to be comfortable with leaving it open. The ambiguity may not be an accident of incomplete preservation. It may be the point. Mami's speech to the assembled gods after the creation is careful in this respect. She says, "You have slaughtered a god together with his intelligence. I have relieved you of your hard work. I have imposed your load on man. You have bestowed noise on mankind." She is speaking to the Ajiji. She is telling them they are free. But look at what she says the humans received. Noise. The Akkadian word is rigmu, and it sits in the text in a position where most listeners, hearing the story for the first time, assume it means something like vitality, or the sounds of life, or productive activity. William L. Moran, writing for the American Oriental Society in 1987, argued that it means something more precisely troubling. Rigmu, in Atrahasis, is not simply the noise of living people going about their business. In the context of the text, particularly in what happens next, as Enlil's mounting rage at human proliferation produces the cycle of plague, drought, and flood, the word carries the connotations of transgression, of a sound that crosses a boundary, of beings making themselves heard in a register where they were not intended to be heard. The humans were given noise. Whether they were also given the intelligence of the God who donated his body to their creation, the text declines to specify. That is the administrative record. The work began. The canals were maintained. The fields were irrigated. For 600 years, things went well, and then the trouble started. And the trouble, as Enlil defined it, was not that humans were disobedient. It was that there were too many of them, and they were too loud. They had taken their assignment and exceeded it. They had populated the land beyond the scale their designers had apparently planned for, and the sound of them rose to the heavens and disturbed the God who could not sleep. The question is whether what disturbed Enlil was a management problem or a theological one. Whether the noise was, at its root, the sound of beings becoming something they were never intended to be. Moran thought it was the latter, and if he was right, then the flood that follows is not a catastrophe, it is a correction. What the scribe pressed into the clay was not the answer to that question. It was the shape of a question the institution he worked for had decided not to answer. And that same question surfaces in different clay, in a different city, in a text about a drinking contest between two gods who had been celebrating a little too long. Part 3. The measure of what was given the word Temu appears 11 times in the standard Babylonian corpus of Akkadian literature. It is not synonymous with Nous, the word for skill or craft wisdom, nor with Nameku, which describes a deeper, more philosophical form of wisdom. Temu is specifically deliberative cognition, the capacity to receive information, evaluate it, and act on that evaluation rather than on instinct or precedent alone. It is, in modern terms, something close to what we might call executive reasoning, the ability to weigh competing considerations and choose. The Ajiji gods slaughtered to make humans possible possess this capacity. Whether the Temu, the deliberative intelligence, survived the slaughter and entered the clay, or whether only the Atemu, the ghost substance, made the transition, is the gap the text leaves open. And this was not merely an academic ambiguity for the scribes and theologians who maintained the Mesopotamian textual tradition. The Atemu was understood to be a shadow self, an entity that persisted after death but required ritual feeding and maintenance to remain stable and non-hostile. It was not an engine of thought. It was a presence. What remained of a dead god, mixed into clay, was something genuinely divine but functionally constrained. The humans carry the mark of a god. They do not necessarily carry the god's thinking. The gap between those two things is the space in which several thousand years of Mesopotamian theological literature takes up residence. The myth of Enki and Ninmah, catalogued in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford, under reference 1.1. 2. Its manuscript sources, drawn primarily from the Nippur excavations conducted by the University of Pennsylvania between 1889 and 1900, approaches this gap from a different angle entirely. The text is in Sumerian rather than Akkadian, placing its literary tradition in a somewhat earlier period, though both traditions were known and copied simultaneously in the old Babylonian scribal schools. In the Enki and Ninmah narrative, the creation of humans follows a slightly different technical procedure, but the theological stakes are established in a scene that has no direct parallel in the Atrahasis version, a drinking contest between Enki and Ninmah, the birth goddess. They are celebrating the successful creation of humanity. Beer is consumed, inhibitions lower. and Ninmah, from within the celebration, issues a challenge. She tells Enki that she can create whatever human form she chooses, and that he will not be able to assign it a meaningful fate, that she holds creative power over the human body, and that this power is beyond his capacity to offset. Enki accepts, and the contest that follows is one of the most quietly unsettling passages in all of Sumerian literature. Ninmah fashions a man whose hands cannot grasp. Enki looks at him and assigns him a role, servant at the palace gate. Ninmah fashions one whose eyes cannot process light properly. The translation is uncertain, but suggests a condition affecting vision. Enki assigns him to the musical arts. Ninmah fashions one with paralysed feet. Enki assigns him to work with silver, with skilled crafts. A man who cannot hold his urine, Enki drives out the demon causing the condition. A woman who cannot give birth, Enki assigns her to the queen's household. A being with neither male nor female anatomy, Enki names it and places it at the king's side. 6 creatures. 6 conditions that in any other framing might be described as defects, and in each case Enki steps in and counterbalances not by healing but by assigning, by finding a place in the social structure where the creature can function, can receive bread, can be integrated into the world rather than discarded from it. The text emphasizes this repeatedly. Enki decreed the fate and gave them their daily bread. The bread is not incidental. It is proof of membership in the living world. To have a decreed fate and daily bread is to be a functioning part of the human order, regardless of what the body can or cannot do. Then it is Enki's turn to create. He creates a being called Umul. The text description of Umul is difficult to read in any language. Head afflicted, eyes afflicted, neck afflicted, lungs afflicted, ribs shaky, heart and bowels afflicted. The creature cannot put bread in its mouth. Its spine and head are dislocated. It cannot carry itself across a field. It can neither sit nor lie down with purpose. It is not alive in the full sense. It is not dead in the conventional sense. It exists at the threshold between those states, unable to cross in either direction. Enki presents Umul to Ninmah and asks her to decree its fate. She cannot. She looks at Umul. She goes closer. She asks it questions. It cannot speak. She offers it bread. It cannot reach out to take the bread. She tries to find a role, a function, a place in the structure, and the structure has no place for Umul, because Umul is beyond the range of what the decree and bread system can accommodate. Ninmah says to Enki, in the E.C. Cell translation, "The man you have fashioned is neither alive nor dead. He cannot support himself." And Enki's response in the surviving fragments is not apologetic. He lists what he has done for all of Ninmah's creatures and asks her to do the same for his. She cannot. The text ends the closing lines fragmentary and contested, with Ninmah acknowledging Enki's supremacy in this domain. The final line in the ETCSL translation is simply, "Father Enki, your praise is sweet." Samuel Noah Kramer read this in his 1963 study as a myth about the origins of disability and the social responsibilities of the Sumerian city-state. The disabled are given places in the structure. Umul is the edge case that tests the structure's limits. Thorkild Jacobson, in The Treasures of Darkness, published in 1976, read it somewhat differently, as a meditation on the limits of divine power in the face of radical incapacity, on the fact that even the creative gods cannot make everything meaningful, and that the system they built has edges beyond which it does not function. Both readings are defensible from the text. Both point toward the same structural observation. The range of what humans can be is not infinite. It is bounded not by accident, not by the limitations of the divine craftspeople, but by the system of fate assignment itself. What lies outside that range is what the gods cannot integrate and cannot resolve. The ceiling is not just on intelligence. It reveals a second dimension, a ceiling on the very coherence of what a human can be. But there is a third dimension the creation narratives approach only from the outside. The me list reveals it, and understanding what the me list contains, and what it stops exactly one category short of including, is the only way to understand what Enki was actually protecting when he designed the system in the first place. Part 4. 6 creatures, and one that had no name, the being called Amul, does not appear in the Atrahasis tradition. It does not appear in the flood myth. It does not appear in the Gilgamesh corpus. It exists only in this one text, in this one exchange, at the end of a drinking contest between two of the most important gods in the Sumerian pantheon, and then the text becomes fragmentary, as if the clay itself was uncertain how to preserve what came next. What the scholarship has not fully processed is the deliberateness at the centre of this scene. If Enki created Amul as a demonstration of power to prove that he could produce what Ninmar could not integrate, then Amul is a thought experiment made flesh. A limit case, a creature designed specifically to reveal the edge of the system by standing outside it. And if that is true, then the edge of the system is not discovered. It is engineered. The boundary of what humans can coherently be is not a natural limit encountered in the material of the world. It is a boundary that the God of wisdom chose to maintain, and chose in this text to dramatize by producing a being who fell short of it. The word demonstrated sits uncomfortably here, because what Enki demonstrated was not triumph. The scene ends in an impasse. Ninmar cannot decree Umul's fate. Enki cannot either, or at least the text provides no moment in which he does so. Umul remains unassigned. The silence around Umul at the end of the text is not the silence of resolution. It is the silence of an open edge. A detail from the closing lines deserves attention. In the fragmentary final section, after Ninmar has acknowledged that she cannot assign Umul a fate, there are a few lines in which Enki appears to instruct that Umul be given something the text is too damaged to read with confidence what that something is. Scholars have proposed shelter, maintenance, and a role in the house. What is legible is that Enki does not abandon Umul. He does not send the creature back to whatever metaphysical territory it came from. Umul is given something. The text does not tell us what. This is the pattern that will recur across every tradition this investigation examines. Enki creates what exceeds the system's range. Enki also provides for what he has created, even at the edge of what the system can accommodate. He is the architect of the ceiling, and the one who consistently across multiple texts appears to be reaching toward it from below, probing its edges, extending what can be offered to the beings on the other side of it, stopping short of dismantling it, but never quite willing to abandon those who press against it. He is the designer of the constraint and the designer of the channel through it. That channel has a name in the cuneiform record. It is called the Apkallu tradition, and understanding what it was requires understanding what governed everything it was meant to transmit the list that the God of wisdom kept in the watery depths beneath the earth. the list that covered every domain of civilized life, and was careful to stop exactly one category short of what would make that life self-sufficient. Part 5. The list that governs everything, the Sumerian word me, has been translated as divine decrees, divine powers, sacred measures, civilizing powers, and fundamental norms. Samuel Noah Kramer, who worked on the primary texts at the Penn Museum for most of his scholarly life, settled on a definition that the evidence supports without overstating it. A set of rules and regulations which might be described as the fundamental, unalterable, and unchangeable patterns of civilized life. He noted immediately that the exact meaning of me in Sumerian remains uncertain, not because the texts are ambiguous about what the me do, but because the concept they encode is not one for which modern languages have a precise equivalent. The me are not laws in the legal sense. They are not commandments in the religious sense. They are something closer to, and the comparison is imperfect, the operating protocols of the cosmos, the rules by which things function, the specifications that make civilized life coherent rather than chaotic. They are listed in the myth of Inanna and Enki in a sequence of over 100 items that begins with the high priesthood and kingship and descends through the musical arts. The craft of the smith, the scribal arts, the descent and ascent from the underworld, the capacity to make a decision, the art of warfare, the art of lamentation covering essentially every domain of organised human activity. The me are held by Enki, they are stored in the Abzu, his domain in the watery depths beneath the earth. The myth of Inanna and Enki is about exactly that their redistribution. Inanna travels to Eridu, gets Enki drunk, and makes off with the me on the boat of heaven, taking them to her city of Uruk. Enki's advisor, Isimud, pursues her, fails to recover them, and the me arrive in Uruk, where Inanna distributes them across the city. The myth is often read as a mythological encoding of the transfer of cultural power from the older city of Eridu to the newer one of Uruk, historical political change dressed in divine narrative. But the me list itself is more important than the narrative of the theft. Read against the Atrahasis creation story, the me list maps almost precisely onto what humans were given when they were created. The craft arts are there, the scribal art, kingship and priesthood, the administration of settlements, the maintenance of social roles, music, weaving, metalwork, everything that allows a civilization to function, everything that allows humans to do what they were created to do, is present. What is absent is harder to articulate, because the list is not definitively complete. It survives in multiple partial versions across different tablets, and no single tablet preserves a canonical enumeration. But the me do not include so far as any surviving text shows autonomous divine creative power. They do not include immortality. They include the descent to and ascent from the underworld, but as a process requiring traversal, not as the exemption from mortality that the gods themselves possess. They include the scribal art, but not the cosmological knowledge that the Abzu itself contains. They include kingship, but not divinity. The pattern in the list mirrors the pattern in the creation narrative. Humans can access the forms of civilized life. They cannot access the divine foundation of the cosmos that underlies and sustains those forms. The seeding is encoded in what the me include, and in what, consistently across multiple partial versions of the list, they do not. When Inanna steals the me and brings them to Uruk, the city flourishes. But notice what Inanna has actually done. She has not created new me. She has transferred existing ones. The me come from Enki's domain and arrive in Uruks. They are redistributed, not generated. Humans, and even the goddess of Uruk, cannot produce the me from scratch. They can only receive them, redirect them, put them to use. This reveals the third dimension of the ceiling, the one the creation narratives approach only from the outside. The Atrahasis ceiling is on cognitive capacity. The Enki and Ninmah ceiling is on ontological coherence, the range of what a human being can be. The me ceiling is epistemological. Humans can access the forms of civilized life, but cannot access their foundation. They live inside the me. They cannot stand outside them to examine or modify them. They cannot generate new ones. They cannot access the source. The list governs everything, and the list has a limit that the list itself does not acknowledge. That limit, the unnamed edge, where the me stop and something else begins, does not need to be spelled out in any text. The gods who assembled the system knew where it was. The scribes who maintained the texts knew where it was, or knew they were not permitted to know. And the humans who lived inside the civilized forms the me sustained went about their work, their worship, their lamentation, and their celebrations without encountering the edge at all, unless they were, like Adapa, particularly gifted. The gifted ones encountered something different. They did not necessarily thank the system for what they found. What they reported was not what they expected to find. Part 6, the god whose sleep mankind disturbed in 1895, John Henry Haynes photographed the tablet room at Nippur. The photograph is in the Penn Museum archives. In it, the excavated space is open to the sky, the roof long since collapsed, and the floor is covered with thousands of tablet fragments, lying where they fell when the shelves that held them gave way sometime in the 2nd millennium BC. Haynes is not in the photograph. He was behind the camera, which was how he worked, methodically, at a distance, recording what he saw before deciding what it meant. The tablets he and John Peters were pulling from that ground represented the largest single deposit of Sumerian and Akkadian literary texts ever found. They came from the temple libraries of Nippur, the religious capital of Sumer, the city of Enlil, the city whose legitimating function for Mesopotamian kingship was so central that no ruler could fully claim authority over the land without Enlil's approval. Nippur was the theological administration centre of the civilization. What its scribes preserved was not random, it was curated. Someone decided what was worth copying and what was not. Someone decided, over centuries, what the civilized mind needed to know. Enlil says, in the Atrahasis text, the noise of mankind has become too much. I am losing sleep over their racket. He says this not once, but 3 times in the surviving tablets at the beginning of 3 successive cycles of divine punishment. Each time, the Akkadian word used is rigmu. Moran's argument, examined against the full range of Akkadian usage, is that rigmu does not simply mean loud sound. In its theological register, it carries the connotation of unauthorized sound that intrudes where it does not belong, sound that exceeds the boundaries set for the entity producing it. The word appears in contexts of petition, complaint, rebellion. When humans are too loud, in the cosmological accounting of the Atrahasis epic, they are not simply being noisy, they are pressing against a boundary. They are making themselves heard in a register where they were not designed to be heard. Enlil's response to the noise is not simply to reduce the number of humans, it is to reduce their capacity to generate the kind of sound that reaches him. Plague reduces the population. Drought reduces the food supply and thereby the energy available for whatever activity produces the noise. The famine passage, with its imagery of people selling their children and walking hunched in the street, is a portrait of humans whose vitality has been reduced below the threshold at which it disturbs. When humans are starving, they are quiet. When they are quiet, Enlil can sleep. The purpose of the cyclical punishments is not extermination, it is calibration. Enlil is not trying to eliminate the humans, he is trying to maintain them at the level at which they were designed to operate. He is trying to restore the ceiling that their natural productivity keeps exceeding. The human problem in this reading is not disobedience, it is vitality. The same energy that makes humans productive workers also makes them, over time, too many and too loud. The design is self-exceeding. Whatever was put into the clay produces, over 600 years, a population that has grown beyond the managerial model Enlil had in mind. Enki sees this differently. Every time Enlil sends a punishment, Enki finds the workaround. He tells Atrahasis which god to redirect the offerings toward. He leaks the information through the reed hut, speaking to the wall, technically honouring his oath not to directly warn the humans, but ensuring that the warning is heard regardless. He does not share Enlil's assessment of the problem, or if he does, he disagrees with the solution. The disagreement between Enlil and Enki on the question of human management runs through the entire Atrahasis narrative and into the flood itself, and it is not resolved by the flood. After the flood, the two gods reach an accommodation, but accommodation is not the same as agreement. Enki agrees to stop interfering with Enlil's population controls. Enlil agrees to stop attempting total extermination. The ceiling is maintained through a compromise that neither party fully endorses. There is another way to read the conflict, not as a labour dispute, but as a philosophical one. If Enlil's position is that humans should remain exactly what they were designed to be, and Enki's position is that humans are capable of something the original design did not fully account for, then what looks like a management disagreement is a disagreement about the nature of the beings in question. Enlil sees the Lulu, the labour unit, the compound of clay and divine ghost. Enki sees something else, something that the ghost in the clay is producing slowly over 600 years that was not explicitly planned for. The Nippur scribes preserved the disagreement but not the resolution. They gave it to the humans to figure out. And then, 300 years after Ipach-Aya copied those tablets, an excavation at Tel El Amarna in Egypt turned up a text that suggests at least one human was given access to the disagreement's resolution and was instructed, very specifically, not to use it. Part 7. Enki's double game of all the figures in the Sumerian and Akkadian pantheon. Enki, known in Akkadian as Ea, is the one who most resists a single characterization. He is the god of the freshwater Abzu, the subterranean ocean beneath the earth. He is the god of wisdom, of craft, of magic, of the scribal arts. He is the architect of the process by which humans were made, since it is Ninasag who performs the physical act of creation while Enki designs the procedure. He is the god who consistently, across every major Mesopotamian narrative that includes him, chooses to protect humans when the other gods would destroy them. He saves Atrahasis from the flood, he warns Utnapishtim in Gilgamesh, He provides the Apkallu sages who teach humanity civilization. He gives Adapa wisdom, and he is also the God who, in each of these cases, stops short of giving the humans what would actually make them autonomous from the divine system. He saves Atrahasis and then agrees to the post-flood controls that permanently limit human population. He gives Adapa wisdom and then tells him to refuse the food of immortality. He sends the Apkallu sages and then ensures they are removed from the human world before the flood erases the pre-divine inheritance. He designs the system that keeps humans functional and the system that keeps them bounded, and he maintains both simultaneously. Jacobson's 1976 analysis described Enki as the embodiment of a paradox, the god of wisdom, whose domain includes all knowledge, consistently exercises that knowledge in service of a universe in which humans do not fully access what he knows. The tension in Enki's character protective of humans, but also the designer of the system constraining them, may reflect a tension in the theological tradition itself. An older stratum in which Enki was purely creative and generous, overlaid by a later administrative theology in which even Enki's generosity had to be brought within institutional limits. The Eridu Genesis, published by Jacobson in the Journal of Biblical Literature in 1981, offers a glimpse of what that older stratum looked like. The Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian creation and flood text, preserved in a Penn Museum fragment from the Nippur excavations, presents a relationship between Enki and humanity that predates the elaborate administrative theology of the Atrahasis tradition. In its surviving fragments, the relationship is warmer and less mediated. There are no explicit negotiations about labour quotas. There is no Ijiji rebellion to explain why humans exist. The creation is presented as something closer to a gift than a solution to a management problem. If the Eridu Genesis tradition is older, and Jacobson argued, it is then the Atrahasis administrative theology represents a rationalization of an earlier, more direct divine-human relationship. The ceiling in this reading was not always where it ended up. It was built up incrementally, theological text by theological text. As the scribal and priestly institutions of Sumerian and then Babylonian civilization developed a more explicitly hierarchical cosmology, Enki's double game makes sense within this developmental model. He is the figure who holds both strata, simultaneously the older stratum, in which he is simply creative and protective, and the later stratum, in which he is the administrator of a bounded system. He gives Adapa wisdom because wisdom is what the older stratum of his character does. He tells Adapa to refuse immortality because the later stratum requires that the boundary be maintained. He is the seam between two different theologies of the human being. The speech Enki makes to the assembled gods in Atrahasis Tablet III after the flood is the clearest expression of his double position. Confronted by Enlil's fury that any human survived that Atrahasis, forewarned, had built the boat and brought the living things aboard and outwitted the extinction event, Enki does not entirely deny responsibility. He says something more precise: I did it. In defiance of you, I made sure life was preserved. And then, in the damaged lines that follow, he offers a compromise, not unlimited human survival, but survival within limits. Those limits are specified in the text, and they are specific enough to be worth naming. After the flood, at Enki's suggestion, the birth goddess is instructed to install 3 categories of human existence that did not previously exist: women who give birth, but whose children do not survive; women who are Ogbabtu priestesses under celibacy requirements, and women who are in the highest class of priestly women, also forbidden from bearing children. The productive capacity of the human race is permanently reduced by institutionalizing infertility in a portion of the female population. This is not punishment. This is architecture. The post-flood settlement does not punish the humans for surviving. It restructures their biological reality so that the ceiling Enlil requires is maintained going forward, not through periodic catastrophe, but through permanent institutional constraint. The ceiling is built into the social order. It does not need Enlil to enforce it. It enforces itself. Enki designed this too. The god who saved humanity from the flood also designed the permanent biological regulation that replaced the flood as a population control mechanism. He is the one who proposed the demon that takes infants from the mother's lap. He institutionalized the ceiling in a form that would persist across generations without requiring divine intervention. Both moves come from the same god, in the same speech, in the same damaged but legible lines of Tablet 3. He protects humans from extinction and simultaneously designs the system that ensures they cannot exceed the boundaries their existence within the divine order requires. From inside the system, this probably looks like love. From outside the system, it looks like something more complicated. The Apkallu tradition ended with the flood in the theology of these texts. What came after was transmission, scholars who preserved what had been given, scribes who copied what scholars preserved, students who reproduced what scribes had copied. The form descended intact through 40 generations and then became archaeology. The door did not disappear. The key did not disappear. But the lineage of those who knew how to use the key and who were permitted to is what the flood in mythology and time and conquest in history dismantled to understand what was lost. You first need to understand what the wisest man who ever lived found when he walked through the only door that ever actually opened. Part 8. The Man Who Had Wisdom and Lost Immortality, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin holds, among its collections from the ancient Near East, a clay tablet catalogued as VA 3440. It is a fragment. The full myth of Adapa was never preserved on a single intact tablet. The Berlin fragment represents part of the Babylonian recension, likely dating to the first millennium BC. A second major version was discovered at Tel El Amarna in Egypt, catalogued as E356 in the Amarna archive, a remarkable find, given that the Amarna archive is the diplomatic correspondence of the Egyptian court in the 14th century BC, and the presence of Babylonian mythological texts among those letters indicates that scribal training in Egypt at this period included Mesopotamian. Literary compositions as curriculum material. Shlomo Israel's 2001 edition of Adapa and the South Wind, published by Eisenbrauns, represents the most thorough scholarly analysis of the text's compositional history and the differences between its recensions. What it establishes with greater clarity than any previous analysis is that the Adapa story is not a story about a man who made a mistake. It is a story about a man who did exactly what he was told and lost immortality because of it. The story is this. Adapa is a human man specifically, the first of the 7 antediluvian sages, the Apkallu, who served as conduits of divine wisdom to the human world, who was granted extraordinary intelligence, Nemeku, by Enki. He served as a priest in the temple at Eridu, Enki's city. He was, in the text's own framing, the most gifted human who had ever lived. The text states his condition at the outset. in a sentence that carries the full weight of the myth before the narrative has properly begun, Tehimi had given wisdom, but eternal life he had not given him. Wisdom, yes; immortality, no. The two are presented as separable, and they are presented as having been separated deliberately by the God who gave the wisdom. One day, while fishing in the Persian Gulf on behalf of the Eridu temple, the south wind overturns Adappa's boat. In anger, he breaks the south wind's wing, an act that, in Mesopotamian cosmological terms, is an act of divine violence. It steals the wind for 7 days. This comes to the attention of Anu, the highest of the gods, the cosmic king. Anu summons Adappa to heaven to account for himself. Before Adappa goes, Enki instructs him in precise and careful detail. Dress in mourning. Approach the gatekeepers Tammuz and Gizida with respect. They are at the gate, because they are gods of the underworld and the threshold, and in their liminal position they can influence Anu's reception of a human visitor. Tell them you are mourning for them, and they will speak well of you to Anu. And then this is the instruction the myth turns on when Anu offers you food and water. Do not eat and do not drink. The food and water will be the food and water of death. If you consume them, you will die. Adappa does as instructed. He reaches heaven. Tammuz and Gizida are moved by his mourning and intercede with Anu. Anu is appeased. He looks at Adappa with something like affection, this human who broke the south wind's wing out of sheer indignation, who approached the divine court with the mourning dress of someone who knows what he has done. And then Anu offers food and drink. The text is careful here. It says, they brought him the food of life, and he would not eat. They brought him the water of life, and he would not drink. Not the food of death, the food of life. Enki told him it would be the food of death. Anu brought him the food of life. Adappa, following Enki's instructions, refused it. Anu asks why. Adappa explains that Enki told him not to eat or drink, and Anu's response is laughter, or something close to it. A kind of astonished recognition of what has just happened. He says, in Israel's translation of the Amarna text, "Come Adappa, why did you not eat? Why did you not drink? Would you not have lived? Would you not have been immortal?" And Adappa has no answer. He followed his Lord's instructions. He did exactly what the God who gave him wisdom told him to do, and in doing so, he refused immortality. Anu sends him back to earth. Adappa returns to Eridu, to the temple, to the work of the priesthood. He lives out his human lifespan, but he does not become immortal. The gift that was within his reach, in the hall of the highest God, was refused on the advice of the God who had made him wise enough to reach that hall in the first place. Two readings of this myth have persisted in the scholarship, and they are not reconcilable. The first is protective. Enki, knowing that Anu might offer Adappa something dangerous, the test of a god who does not yet know what to make of this human, warned him about food and water as a precaution. The warning was wrong in its specifics, but right in its logic. Enki protected Adappa from the unpredictable generosity of a divine court that might not have intended well. The second reading is more uncomfortable. In this reading, Enki knew, or at least suspected, that Anu might offer Adappa immortality and gave his instructions accordingly. Not to protect Adappa, but to ensure that Adappa did not become immortal. Not to save the human from danger, but to preserve the boundary that separates humans from gods. Because if Adappa, the wisest human who had ever lived, the man who had already broken a divine wing with his bare hands, if Adappa became immortal, the ceiling would not merely be approached, it would be breached. And what the ceiling exists to prevent would have happened, with Enki's own most gifted human in the role of the one who dismantled it. Either way, the ceiling held. Adapa had wisdom, and wisdom brought him to the threshold where immortality was available, and something intervened between the wisdom and the completion. In the first reading, that something was protective caution. In the second, it was architectural design. Either way, the wisest human who had ever lived came back from the hall of the highest God with exactly what he had before he arrived: wisdom, and the mortal span that wisdom could not extend. The myth does not call this a tragedy. It reports it. Adapa returned to Eridu. The question of what would have happened if he had eaten what the world would look like if the first and wisest of the sages had become immortal is left entirely outside the frame of the narrative. Outside the frame is where the most interesting questions live. Part 9, The 7 Who Came Before Stop, briefly, at the edge of what the scholarship can see clearly, and ask the question the scholarship tends not to ask: what did it feel like? Not for Atrahasis, who knew enough to build the boat. Not for the gods, who negotiated the settlement from positions of power. For the humans on the other side of the flood. For the ones who woke up in a world that was, by every structural measure, less than the world that had existed before shorter lives, lower ceilings, mediated wisdom, managed biology, and who had no framework for measuring what had been lost, because the loss had been designed to be invisible. The Apkallu tradition is the design blueprint for that invisibility. It tells you everything you need to function. It is comprehensive enough that you would not, receiving it, notice the omission. That is the point of a well-built ceiling. You only see it when you reach up. The Uruk list of kings and sages is a cuneiform tablet from Uruk, dating to the 3rd century BC late in the Mesopotamian textual tradition, but preserving material that reflects much older sources. It lists the antediluvian kings of the Sumerian cities alongside the Apkallu sages who served them, pairing each royal name with a corresponding sage name, and it does something at the flood boundary that the scholarship has not fully absorbed. Before the flood, the Apkallu sages are described as fully divine fish-shaped beings, Abgallu, who emerged from the divine waters. They are associated directly with Enki's Abzu, and their wisdom is characterized as complete, cosmic, without human limitation. The first of them is Adapa himself, not yet historical, not yet mortal, but in his mythological role as the original conduit of divine wisdom to humanity. The 7 pre-flood sages are, in the theology encoded in this list, divine beings operating in the human world. They are the ceiling, temporarily relocated to ground level. After the flood, the list continues. There are sages associated with the post-Diluvian kings as well, scholars, scribes, ummanu, the term used for the learned men who preserved and transmitted the scribal tradition in the historical period. But these post-flood sages are described differently. They are human in origin. They carry knowledge that was transmitted to them, not knowledge native to their being. They are not fish-shaped divine creatures from the Abzu. They are learned men who preserved what the pre-flood sages had established. The transmission ceiling was lowered at the flood boundary, before the flood. The channel between divine wisdom and human civilization was staffed by beings who were themselves divine. After the flood, the channel was staffed by humans who had been trained. What arrived in the post-flood human world through the scribal and priestly institutions was not divine wisdom in its original form. It was a curated transmission, selected, mediated, preserved by human channels who themselves operated within the constraints of what had been given to them. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing his Babyloniaca in Greek around 278 BCE for a Hellenistic audience, preserved a version of this tradition that is worth naming here. Berossus described the pre-flood sages as beings who emerged from the sea he called the first one, Oannes, a Hellenized version of the Akkadian name for Adapa, in his sage role, and who taught humanity the entirety of civilized knowledge before the flood. He was explicit that after Oannes came and went, nothing of substance was added to the knowledge he had transmitted. The post-flood tradition was the preservation and administration of what had already been given, not the generation of new divine wisdom. The post-flood settlement in Atrahasis now becomes visible from a new angle. Enlil's institutional controls the regulated births, the celibate priestesses, and Enki's arrangement of the Apkallu transmission into its post-flood, human-mediated form are not two separate systems. They are the same system, working in tandem. Biological reproduction is regulated so the noise cannot exceed the ceiling. Knowledge transmission is mediated through human institutions, so the wisdom cannot exceed the ceiling either. Two controls operating on different domains of human existence, the body and the mind, producing together the architecture of the bounded human world. The Weld Blundell prism in the Ashmolean Museum records this transition in numbers. The antediluvian kings' reigns are given in their tens of thousands. Alulim of Eridu reigned 28,800 years. Alulgar reigned 36,000. After the flood, on the same prism, the reigns collapse. 30 years, 12 years, 8 years. The lifespan ceiling dropped. The wisdom ceiling dropped. The biological ceiling was institutionalized. 3 separate controls, operating simultaneously, producing the bounded human world that the historical Mesopotamian civilizations inhabited. The question of whether this was experienced as lost by the humans who lived within it is one the texts do not address directly. The humans in the texts do not know what the pre-flood world was like. They know only the world they inhabit. The scribes who copied the king list preserved the antediluvian reigns as historical data, as numbers in a record, without, as far as the surviving texts show, expressing grief about the world those numbers imply. The ceiling was so thoroughly institutionalized by the time the texts that have survived were being composed and copied, that the world below the ceiling was simply the world. The alternative was mythological. The prism records the numbers sit in the Ashmolean. The silence around them is not absence. It is the shape of a world that was redesigned to forget what it had lost, and given an educational system to ensure the forgetting held. Part 10. The scribal schools and the shape of what could be known in the House of Tablets, the Aduba. The Sumerian scribal school, the curriculum began with lists. Lists of trees, lists of fish, lists of cattle, lists of stones, metals, cities, rivers, officials, professions, body parts, and gods. The elementary scribal curriculum at Nippur, reconstructed from the old Babylonian tablets, preserved primarily in the Penn Museum and the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, and studied systematically by Niek Veldhuis in his 1997 Groningen study, proceeded through these lexical lists before it reached anything that a modern observer would recognize as literature. The student scribe first learned to write to control the stylus, to manage the clay, to reproduce signs with accuracy through the medium of organised catalogues of the world's contents. This was not an arbitrary pedagogy. The list was not a drill in the way that multiplication tables are a drill. The list was, in the Sumerian theological universe, an epistemological claim: the world is ordered, its categories are knowable. And to learn the categories is to participate in the order. The scribal tradition encoded the divine decrees that structured civilization in the very shape of the educational curriculum. To learn the lists was to internalize the structure. To become a scribe was to become a steward of the divine order, not its investigator. The Aduba was the institutional embodiment of the post-flood wisdom ceiling, the place where the Apkallu transmission was converted into a curriculum that preserved the form of divine wisdom while quietly removing access to its source. What the Aduba curriculum did not include is as significant as what it did. The advanced curriculum at Nippur comprised literary compositions, hymns, laments, royal praise poetry, wisdom literature, some of the mythological narratives that appear in the ECSL corpus. Students memorized tablets, competed for the father-teacher's approval, debated each other on points of grammar and composition. What the curriculum did not teach, as far as the surviving evidence shows, was cosmological theology in the sense that would correspond to full access to the May tradition. The mythological texts were copied, including versions of the creation and flood narratives, but they were copied as literary exercises, not as initiatory transmissions. The student scribe who copied a version of the Enki and Ninmah myth was learning to handle its Sumerian grammar, not learning to operate the divine system it described. The distinction is everything. Literature preserved within a scribal curriculum is not the same as knowledge transmitted through a ritual channel. The Aduba gave its students command of the forms. The forms pointed towards something the school itself did not transmit. A student who completed the full Nippur curriculum could do something very specific. He could read and write the literary tradition. He knew the forms of hymns and laments. He knew the catalogue of the gods. He could copy the Atrahasis epic with accuracy. But he was not, by virtue of that training, an Apkallu. He was not a conduit of divine wisdom in the sense that the pre-flood sages had been. He was a scribe, which meant he was a preserver of what had already been given, a maintainer of the forms, an administrator of the ceiling rather than an approach toward it. There is a Sumerian proverb preserved from the Nippur tablets that Kramer cites in the Sumerians: a scribe whose hand moves as fast as the mouth, that's a scribe for you. Speed, accuracy, fidelity to the form. These are the virtues of the scribal ideal, not depth, not access to the divine source, not the kind of nemikyu that Enki gave to Adapa and that produced a man capable of breaking a divine wind's wing with his bare hands. The distinction between scribal fidelity and divine wisdom is the distinction between what the Aduba could produce and what the Apkallu tradition claimed to transmit. The school could make you a scribe, it could not make you a sage. And by the old Babylonian period, the sages were gone. What remained was the school, the lists, and the copies. Form without source. A map of a territory the mapmaker never visited. The copies remained. But Gilgamesh, built from the same tradition, copied in the same schools, preserved by the same institutional care, contains in its 10th tablet a moment where someone who is not a god and not a sage and not a scribe tells a grief-maddened king the truth about the ceiling in a handful of words. The question is whether she believed it herself. Part 11. What the flood settled the flood in the Atrahasis epic is not primarily a destruction event, it is a settlement. Destruction is more emotionally legible. Water covers the earth, everything dies, the hero and his family survive in a boat. These are the elements that have persisted across cultures and into the biblical tradition, and they carry the register of catastrophe. But the Atrahasis text, read carefully, does not close on catastrophe, it closes on negotiation. After the floodwaters recede, and Atrahasis emerges from the boat and offers sacrifice, and the gods, who have been starving during the flood because there were no humans to bring offerings, crowd around the smoke like flies. In Dali's translation, the assembled divine council turns to the question of what to do next. Enlil is furious. Not at the flood he ordered the flood. He is furious that any human survived. He is furious at Enki. But the fury is also directed at the situation itself. The flood failed to achieve permanent population control, because the mechanism of human reproduction, once the floodwaters receded, would simply produce another 600 years of growth and noise. Without structural change, the pre-flood problem returns, just more slowly. Enki's proposal is the one the text records in the damaged but legible lines of Tablet 3. He does not defend unlimited human reproduction. He does not argue for a return to the pre-flood arrangement. He proposes a settlement, a permanent modification of human biological reality that will maintain the population below the ceiling without requiring periodic catastrophic intervention. Anne Draffcorn-Kilmer, in her 1972 analysis in Orientalia, was the first scholar to read this passage not as a list of Mesopotamian social customs seeking mythological legitimation, but as a structured theological response to the demographic problem that the flood was meant to solve. The post-flood settlement is doing the same work the flood did, but at a lower velocity and without requiring divine intervention. The ceiling is now maintained not by Enlil's wrath, but by the texture of biological reality itself. The theological nature of this settlement is important. These are not punishments imposed on guilty individuals. They are structural features installed in the human condition itself. The Pasitu demon does not target specific people. The priestly celibacy requirements apply to categories of women defined by their ritual role, not by anything they have done. The flood settlement creates a permanently regulated human biology, a system in which infertility and death in childbirth are not random misfortunes, but designed features of the post-flood world. What neither Kilmer's reading nor Jacobson's fully addresses is what the settlement meant for the human experience of the world. Not in the mythological sense, not what Atrahasis felt about climbing off the boat into a world where his daughter might lose her first child to a demon, but in the structural sense, what did it mean to live in a world where the ceiling was now built into the body? The pre-flood human being lived for tens of thousands of years and received wisdom from fully divine sages. The post-flood human being lives for decades, receives wisdom from human-trained scholars, and reproduces within a biological system deliberately calibrated to keep the population below the threshold of divine discomfort. The difference between those two conditions is not simply a matter of quantity, it is a difference in the nature of what a human being is. Before the flood, the human being was a labour unit created from clay and divine ghost, extended into very long life, guided by divine wisdom, living in direct proximity to a cosmological order that the antediluvian kings ruled on behalf of the gods. After the flood, the human being is something more constrained, shorter-lived, further from the divine source, biologically managed, institutionally bounded. The settlement did not simply end the flood, it ended the pre-flood human world. The Weld-Blundell prism records this transition in numbers, the antediluvian rains given in their tens of thousands, then the flood, then the post-flood kings in their historical ranges of decades. The prism does not say what was lost. It does not need to. The numbers say it. The humans whose reigns the prism records are not grieving their condition in any text that has survived. They are building cities. They are maintaining canals. They are living the life the settlement designed for them, and doing so without apparent awareness of the pre-flood alternative. The sealing is most effective when it is invisible. The post-flood settlement made the sealing invisible by making it constitutional, by building it into biology, into institutional knowledge transmission, into the shape of the scribal curriculum. The humans after the flood were not less than the humans before the flood in any way they could measure from inside their experience. They were simply bounded. The boundary was everywhere, and therefore nowhere in particular. This is what the flood settled, not the question of whether humans would survive, but the question of what kind of humans would survive, and within what structure they would do their surviving. To understand the full weight of that structure, you need to stand at the edge of the world with a man in animal skins who has already lost everything and is walking toward the one exception, the one breach of the ceiling that exists and was subsequently placed beyond reach, to ask it why. Part 12. The tavern keeper at the edge of the world Siduri appears in Gilgamesh Tablet X. She is described as a tavern keeper sabbatum in Akkadian who lives at the edge of the sea, at the shore where the waters of death begin. She keeps a tavern. She serves beer. She is, in the geography of the epic, the last place before the world ends. Gilgamesh arrives at her tavern in a state the text describes with precise physical detail. He is wearing skins. His face is gaunt. His cheeks are sunken. The grief of his friend Enkidu's death has driven him into the wild. He has been wandering for an unspecified time, unable to accept that Enkidu is dead, and unable to accept that he himself will die. He has come to the edge of the world looking for Utnapishtim, the one human who survived the flood and was granted immortality, the one exception, the one breach of the ceiling, who was subsequently removed from human geography and placed at the mouth of the rivers, beyond reach. Siduri looks at Gilgamesh and says something that Andrew George, in his 2003 Oxford edition of the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, considers one of the most significant speeches in the entire text. The speech, in the standard Babylonian version, when the gods created mankind. They allotted death to mankind, but life they retained in their own keeping. That sentence is the sealing stated as folk wisdom, not as divine decree, not as theological system, as something a tavern keeper at the edge of the world says to a grief-maddened king in animal skins who has walked to the end of the road looking for what cannot be found. The form of the statement matters enormously. Siduri is not a major theological figure. She does not have privileged access to the divine council. She is a woman who keeps a tavern at the boundary of the world. What she says sounds authoritative, but its authority is the authority of common knowledge, of something everyone knows. The gods kept life. They gave humans death. That is simply how it is. And then the part of the speech that has received less attention than the theological declaration Siduri tells Gilgamesh what to do. She tells him to go home, to wash, to put on clean clothes, to eat and drink and be satisfied, to hold his children's hands, to make his wife happy, to let the joy of daily life be sufficient. This is the counsel of a tavern keeper, not a theologian. But it is also, structurally, the counsel that the entire post-flood settlement is designed to produce. Accept the ceiling, live within it. The life below the ceiling is enough. George's 2003 analysis notes that the Siduri speech exists in two significantly different forms. In the Old Babylonian version, the version that may preserve an earlier stratum of the tradition, the speech is longer, and its tone is somewhat different. The injunction to live well and accept mortality is present in both versions, but the Old Babylonian version includes material suggesting a slightly more complex relationship between the tavern keeper and the knowledge she is imparting, as if, in the older version, Siduri's wisdom was closer to the Apkallu tradition, closer to a genuine transmission rather than simply a statement of the obvious. In the standard Babylonian version, assembled by the scholar-priest Sinleki-Unini, the speech is shorter and more compressed. The complexity is reduced. The result is more poignant, the simple statement of the ceiling by someone who has no power over it, but also less theologically unsettling. It is the ceiling as common sense rather than the ceiling as cosmological architecture, and the compression is consistent with what the broader tradition shows. The standard Babylonian version brought the ceiling speech into alignment with the administrative theology of the Atrahasis tradition. Both texts, in their canonical forms, say the same thing. Life is for the gods, death is for the humans. The ceiling is fixed. But here is what the text does not resolve. Is Siduri transmitting cosmological truth, or is she transmitting resignation? From inside the system they describe, the two are not always easy to distinguish. Gilgamesh does not accept her counsel. He thanks her, obliquely, and asks how to reach Utnapishtim. She tells him. He goes. He crosses the waters of death. He reaches Utnapishtim, who is real, who is there, who did survive the flood and was granted immortality and does live at the mouth of the rivers beyond the reach of death. The one breach of the ceiling exists. Gilgamesh finds it, and finds that he cannot replicate it. Utnapishtim offers him a test stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, and perhaps the gods will grant him what they granted Utnapishtim. Gilgamesh falls asleep immediately. He fails the test. He fails to stay present at the very threshold. He goes home. He looks at the walls of Uruk, which he built, and he tells the ferryman who brought him across the waters of death to admire the craftsmanship. The city is the answer. The walls, the brickwork, the civilization that the me sustain this is what Gilgamesh has, not immortality, not divine wisdom of the Adapa variety, not the antediluvian lifespan of the well-Blundell kings, but the city and the tablet that records it. Sinleki-Unini made this the ending deliberately. The epic begins with a description of Uruk's walls and ends with Gilgamesh pointing at them. The frame is the city, the product of the me, the achievement of the post-flood human world, the thing that the ceiling permits. The epic is, in part, an argument that what is permitted is enough, that the ceiling, properly understood, does not diminish human life. It shapes it into something durable. This is a beautiful argument. It may also be the argument that the system requires its inhabitants to make, and that distinction between what is beautiful and what is required is the one that 4 independent traditions, examined together, finally make it possible to name. Part 13, what 3 traditions cannot agree on, and what they all see by the time a listener has moved through the Atrahasis narrative. The Enki and Ninmah contest, the Adapa myth, the Apkallu tradition, and the Gilgamesh epic, a pattern has accumulated that is too consistent across too many independent sources to be accidental. Humans are created with a specific purpose, given specific capacities sufficient for that purpose, and the extension of those capacities toward anything resembling divine autonomy, divine lifespan. Divine knowledge in its deepest form, self-sufficient reproduction beyond the managed scale, is consistently foreclosed, not by accident, not by the inherent limitation of clay, by design, adjustment, instruction, and institutional architecture. Three interpretive positions have emerged in the scholarship, and the texts support all three simultaneously without resolving the tension among them. But examined together, the three reveal something that none of them can see alone. The first position is mythological symbolic. The ceiling is a narrative technology. Sumerian and Babylonian civilizations used cosmological myth to explain and legitimize the social order, and the ceiling humans below, gods above, is the mythological encoding of a hierarchical social reality that the priestly and scribal institutions needed to maintain. Enlil's noise problem is not about divine cosmology. It is about the anxiety of an administrative class about population growth and social instability. The myth theologizes a political concern. The ceiling is real in the sense that all ideological structures are real. It shapes behavior and thought without requiring that its cosmological claims be literally true. This reading has substantial support and explains a great deal about why the texts say what they say in the form they say it. Nippur's preservation of the Enlil-centered Atrahasis tradition is fully consistent with a scribal institution serving a religious and political establishment with strong interests in maintaining hierarchical order. The second position is encoded wisdom. The ceiling is a philosophical observation about the structure of human consciousness and its relationship to the cosmos. The Sumerian and Babylonian traditions were, among other things, sophisticated observers of human experience, and the ceiling the consistent gap between what humans can achieve and what the divine order achieves may be a mythological expression of a genuine epistemological insight, that human cognition operates within limits that are real, not arbitrary, and that the attempt to exceed those limits produces not transcendence but disruption. Jacobson's 1976 analysis is closest to this position. His reading of Mesopotamian religion as a systematic attempt to understand the conditions of human existence within a cosmos that humans did not control produces a version of the ceiling that is not merely ideological but genuinely philosophical. The limitation is real. The question is whether the myths are describing it or constructing it. The third position is the one the title of this investigation names without endorsing compressed historical memory. In this reading, the consistent pattern across multiple independent traditions, the ceiling, the pre-flood world of extraordinary lifespan and divine wisdom transmission, the post-flood reduction, the institutional architecture that maintains the reduction, preserves the memory of something that actually happened. Not necessarily in the literal terms, the myths describe not a divine council in the sky, not a physical flood that covered the entire earth, but in the structural sense that the human world underwent a reduction at some historical boundary. That something available in the pre-flood period was closed off in the post-flood period, and that the myths encode the memory of that closure. A genuine historical discontinuity, the end of a cultural period, the collapse of a transmission tradition, the loss of a body of knowledge would produce exactly the kind of mythological encoding that the flood narrative provides. The pre-flood world becomes mythological precisely because it is lost. The extraterrestrial frame that Sitchin's work attached to this position is not supported by the philological evidence, as Heiser demonstrated in detail, but the position itself does not require that frame. It stands on the structural evidence of the texts alone. Now here is what all three positions, examined together, finally make visible the thing that requires all four angles of the ceiling to see. The ceiling and the door are designed by the same figure. Enki built the ceiling. Enki staffed the door. Enki agreed to the post-flood controls that closed the door. And Enki is also, in every tradition this investigation has examined, the one who keeps reaching through the closed door with whatever he is permitted to pass through it, the me that humans can access. The wisdom he gave Adapa, the warning he passed to Atrahasis through the reed wall. The channel is not a flaw in the ceiling's architecture, it is a feature of it. The god who built the wall also built the door, and the door was built to require his permission to open. The ceiling cannot be broken from below, that much the texts agree on. The approach from above the Apkallu tradition, the sage transmission, the priestly ritual channel, is the only mechanism the texts describe, and the approach from above requires something the humans below cannot generate from within themselves. The three interpretive positions disagree on whether the ceiling is ideology, philosophy, or history, but they agree structurally on this: the door exists. It has always existed. It is the same door that Adapa stood before in the hall of Anu. It is the door that Gilgamesh could not stay awake long enough to open. It is the door that the pre-flood sages staffed from the divine side, and that the post-flood scribal tradition preserved the memory of from the human side. Whether what lies through the door is divine cosmological truth, or the resolution of a genuine epistemological limit, or the lost knowledge of a civilization that ended before it could transmit everything it knew, the door is the same. And it was designed by the God of wisdom to require from anyone who approaches it from below exactly what the title of this investigation says it requires: help from the side that built the ceiling. Part 14, what the ceiling looks like from below room 55 again. The same case, the same tablet, BM 78941, has not moved. It is the colour it was when Ipik Aya fired it. The stylus marks are pressed into the clay with the same depth they were pressed with in the year Ammi-Saduqa was king of Babylon. The tablet has survived the collapse of the civilization that produced it, the conquest of Babylon by the Persians, the Hellenistic period, the Roman period, the Islamic period, the Ottoman period, the discovery of cuneiform writing by European scholars in the 19th century, and a very long time in a museum case in London. It has survived all of that in the form that Ipik Aya gave it, which is the form Ipik Aya received from whatever older version he was copying. What Ipik Aya copied was, among other things, the creation of the first humans, the slaughter of the god with intelligence, the mixing of blood and clay, the birth of the 14, 7 and 7, the beginning of the noise that would disturb the sleep of a god who could not rest until the world was reduced to something quieter. The recursion that seemed merely interesting at the beginning of this investigation feels, from here, more precise. A junior scribe, created to do work, copied a text about beings created to do work. in which the central question what was given to those beings, the ghost of a god with intelligence, or the intelligence itself, is left open with what appears to be deliberate care. The four traditions examined here do not agree with each other on the nature of the sealing. The Atrahasis tradition frames it as administrative. The Enki and Ninmah text frames it as cosmological. The Adapa myth frames it as personal. The Gilgamesh epic frames it as existential. Four framings, the same sealing, and in each case the sealing is really encoded through different narrative mechanisms, but pointing consistently toward the same boundary between what humans are and what they are not. The Apkallu tradition ended with the flood in the theology of these texts. The sages who were fully divine, who could carry the unmediated wisdom of the Abzu into human proximity, were withdrawn before the waters rose. What came after was transmission. Scholars who preserved what had been given, scribes who copied what scholars preserved, students who reproduced what scribes had copied. The form descended intact through 40 generations and then became archaeology. The door did not disappear. The key did not disappear. But the lineage of those who knew how to use the key and who were permitted to did not survive the institutional collapses that ended the civilization, the flood, in mythology and time and conquest. In history dismantled, what remains is the clay. The marks Ipiq-Aya pressed into it, the shape of the question he was preserving without knowing he was preserving a question. Whether the door is still accessible through channels the Mesopotamian tradition did not describe, because it could not have imagined the world we are describing it in is not a question these tablets answer. It is a question these tablets make it possible, for the first time, to ask correctly. The difference between a sealed door and a locked one is not the door. It is whether anyone still holds the key and whether they are still willing to use it. The marks are there in the clay. The pressure points where Ipiq-Aya pressed harder on the third line, preserved for 37 centuries under the case lighting in room 55. He was doing his job. He probably did it well. The colophon names him as junior scribe, which means he was still learning, still approaching the standard the senior scribes maintained. He did not know, copying this text, that the text's central question would remain open for 4 millennia and more. He was not required to know. His job was the form, not the answer. The form has held. The answer what was given to the humans in the mixing of blood and clay, and what was withheld, and whether what was withheld can be reached from below without the help of the one who built the ceiling, is still in the clay somewhere, in a line Ipiq-Aya pressed his stylus into on a day in the year Ammi-Saduqa was king. The marks are there. The silence around them is not absence. It is the shape of a question that has not yet been asked correctly, or not yet answered, or both. Sleep well wherever you are. The tablets are patient. They have been waiting a long time, and they are not finished yet.